Alrighty, so let's start on 12.1, basic form validation. So when you think about form validation, you think about why do we need it? Why do we need it is that if left to their own devices, we as users and we as a larger user community of forms, which by the way, it's most of the way the web works is form submissions. Because of that, left to our own devices, we will give wrong information. We're too quick, we don't pay attention. And then we as developers need to validate that the information that we're given is at our best. In other words, if we implement it to the best, we get good data. Because that data that we're going to act upon that is from the form validation is critical to something. It's an input to something. It's a submission to something. So this is such an important topic, which is why I've rethought it about how much time we're going to give it. Now, in this case, right, if we go look at our existing form, right, we know that we've been able to, up until now, just, click calculate footprint. So that is not normal. And let's talk about how we would now implement the idea of form validation. So one of the conversations I had with Gemini in my ongoing session here is I just wanted to do a check because what we're about to do is going to be done in the app.js. And I'm like, okay, can we put this in a module? And the answer is absolutely, right? You could write all this code that we're about to write in the module. And so, but the way we're going to do it, Gemini's recommendation, best practice maintainability, is actually a single purpose of the app.js is to orchestrate the events and the actions. So validation is a separate concern. So in that case, it's making an argument that we should maybe consider putting it in a module. So the cons is a beginner overhead. And this one, I kind of went, I definitely have phrased this when I'm having this ongoing conversation that we are writing code for students that are new to beginning writing of code. So, and then I'm like, okay, so I thought I'd read through here, right? And ultimately, no performance gain, right? So the cost of the additional import is minimal, but the cognitive cost to the student is high because, again, you're having to juggle that. I don't know I agree with this completely, but I'm like, oh, you know what? For now, we can totally do it. So I decided to go ahead and this was the recommendation, right? Primary is doable. Let's just keep it in the app.js for now. Okay, and then you can, and this is really good, is next level refactoring. In other words, this would be something in the future as it, and it's already going to be sizable in my opinion. Not just in my opinion. It's not that it's doing a lot, it's that we just have to handle a lot. Okay, and only one file. So that was the idea, okay? And I love that it reflects back on me, the things that I've discussed with it right now. But it also gives me like, okay, here's what you could talk about, right? So let's go back to here now that we've just said the idea of how are we going to implement this. So what we're going to do here is we'll add perform validation before processing. So where would that be? So logically it would make sense where we're going to do that is actually in the app.js, right? So in our app.js where we currently have our form submission, right? So we prevent the default, we go and get the form inputs, right? Here would be the most logical place for us to do this. Let's go ahead and add, right, perform basic form processing before processing. Okay, so now that we have it, before we do anything else in this file, right, let's actually just say we're going to, and in this case, right, perform basic form validation, and I switched it, doesn't quite matter. So in here, what we're going to say, and we're going to end up writing a function in a minute, but I know the name of the function, so we'll just say if, okay, if, and I'll put for now the actual name of the function, if a valid form, okay? And we'll end up passing form data to it, okay? If valid form, okay, so if it's valid, then, okay, then we're going to do, uh-oh, my bad here. It's just wrapping that, right? Okay, so if it's valid, then what are we going to do? Okay, so in this case, let's actually, before we write any more here, let's actually go and look and start writing this function. Okay, so I'm going to write it right above, since it's a, you know, kind of makes sense for now. So I'm going to say, in this case, valid form. Okay, now from here on out, and you're going to hear me talk about this, and I think I'll do an attendance post about this soon, we're going to end up writing, because we've been writing named functions, so now we're going to continue named functions where we give it const, give it a name, is going to actually equal, in this case, our open and close parameters. But instead of writing function, we're just going to, as our standard from here on out, is to actually write arrow functions. So named arrow functions, and again, you'll hear me talk about named arrow functions probably in week 13 attendance, because I'm going to have us go through and modify so that all of our functions are consistent with this, and reasons why there's only a couple of edge cases where you wouldn't, but this is the syntax, okay, that you will see, and some of you are already using, I've noticed in your code, and some of you are using the original function that we did, that we wrote, and before we upgraded it to a name function. Just FYI here, you'll see it later. So we know we're passing to, okay, this form right here, the form data. Now we could call it something else, but in this case, there's really no reason to make it something different, because it is actually only doing this one particular thing with the form data. So we'd say, and we're going to set a variable is valid, very common here, and we'll set it as a Boolean value of true. So we'll start with the it's true, and then we'll write logic, okay? We'll write logic that says, like, if form data dot, and in this case we're going to do the first rule, okay? So we'll do whatever it is, so and we'll do that logic in a minute, okay? We'll come back to that. We'll just say is valid. In this case, if it falls to here, we know there was something wrong with the logic that we wrote up in here. And again, this is not full logic, it's just the beginning of it. We'd say equals false. Okay, so at that point, we've changed that variable to false. And what we need to do here, after we fall through, because we'll end up writing all the logic in here, so we would just say return is valid, okay? So just look at that for a minute to understand the flow of our actual logic of our validation. So we'll have a validation check. As a matter of fact, let's just go ahead. Returns, right? Let's go ahead and actually add these to the top of our form, okay? Oop. Let's do that. Okay, so we're taking in form data. We're going to return, in this case, okay, we're going to return a, if it's true, the validation passes. If it's false, otherwise. Okay, so that tells us the condition that we're returning that. And then this is just a FYI, so we note later that we are actually using named arrow function, so you know what that means, and it just gives you a little more context. Okay, so we'll write this in a minute. Okay, so now given our logic, now again, this is not written, this is just a placeholder. Matter of fact, let's just say for now we'll call it a Boolean of true. Okay, so if it's true, if this logic falls, we know that this was marked as false. Given that, down here, what we have to think about is if, because what's going to come back, true or false? Well, what we want to do is test, okay? So what we want to do, let me see here, is that, console log form validation failed, stop. So in this case, we want if form validation, didn't pass, Well, in order to check for that condition, because right now, let's say it, in this logic block, it actually ends up setting it as false, right? It's not false. So we actually here need to flip this and say not. If not, valid form. And you can read it like that because that's actually what we're saying. If not valid form, then stop right here. Okay? Nothing else is going to happen. But how do we make that happen, right? How do we make it stop going on down? Is we just do, in this case, we just do a return. We just say, hey, at this point, whatever called you, don't do anything else. Okay? Right? Otherwise, what are we doing? Okay, actually, let's do it right here, just so we know, right? So when this return is actually stopping our validation, if execution is, stop execution if validation fails, it's not valid. Okay, so and now we're going to walk through the code. Okay, so actually we'll just put, because we'll end up finishing just the first rule on the end here. Okay, otherwise, right? Console log validation passed. Okay, proceed with submission. So now let's go over and just with, actually it won't work yet. Yeah, it will. Actually, yeah, it will. Because in this case, we're not actually testing anything. We've just set the Boolean of true. So now this is a case where you say, if this is true, right? You know before you even return it what should happen. Okay, but let's actually go watch it happen, because that's part of us understanding the code that we're writing. So where would I set this at? I would set this right here. Okay, and then in order for me to see this run, I have to come down here and say calculate, or sorry, submit. And so now I can actually step into this. It's going to call the function. It's passing the form data. It's setting is valid. And now we know that because we've set this as a hard-coded Boolean, we know it's going to say, hey, now, and this is why we use, remember, this is why we use let here. Okay, so now, yep, is valid is false. We started with the assumption everything's true. Whatever triggers get hit, and we'll write multiple layers of if logic to check each of our inputs. Ultimately, by the time we're finished, return is valid. And so we know now, right, because in this case not, right, so it's returning. What got returned here, right, is a what? It's false. Okay, so this got returned. I was trying to actually have it show, because I know I can do that, and maybe I just wasn't grabbing the whole thing. There it is. Okay. Yeah. So the not gives it now the true value, and it drops through. So if we didn't have the not on there, it wouldn't have worked. So now we go, okay, let's actually have our console up. I don't know why mine is not show console drawer. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to come back here. I'll step through this. Form validation failed, stop submission, and now we'll return, and nothing else will happen. Okay, so now that we have this, right, so this actually is where we'll end this particular first step. Okay, and on the next one, let's just go ahead and do this now. Let's go ahead and in our, okay, so now we're going to do, household must be at least one. All right, so there'll be a whole other conversation about first how do we code that and how do we test for it. Okay, so your should be, I don't know why the S got in there. Basic form validation. I did give you some additional checks here. How important? It is very important, so do some additional logic. And then the idea of what we had actually covered in attendance is Why do we use the get ID for form validation? Okay, and I probably will add something in here about the thing that I just talked about with, should we have a separate module? You could do some additional research just on your own to better understand, the ideas of what we're implementing. And then, by the way, if you wanted to on your own, you could actually go take this code base outside and say, you know what, how could I actually write this as a module just for that experience, not for our code base, but for your own experience. Okay, go ahead and do your commit here, and we'll move on to the next one.